Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate having the opportunity of speaking with you while I'm in Richmond. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you personally, but we drove up. We were from the deep south, and very frankly, I'm afraid of this snow and ice, and I want to get home. We've been here for a week. To begin with, I'd like to tell you a little about the Capital Punishment Research Project, which is located at the Law Center of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. This is the first time that a serious effort has been made not only to chronicle every legal execution carried out under civil authority that has occurred in the United States from colonial days down to and including the present, but also to gather as much information on each in one central location for the eventual use of interested persons. I started this work at my home in Headland, Alabama, some 15 years ago, and approximately 7.5 years ago, the University of Alabama Law Center agreed to fund the project and took me to Tuscaloosa, and I have been there since that time. On August the 16th of this year, we were the recipient of a grant from the National Science Foundation, which will enable us to computerize the data that we have already gathered and make it more accessible to scholars who are interested in using it for various reasons. The computerization is being carried out under the direction of Dr. John Smickler of our Criminal Justice Department. Currently, or prior to coming to Richmond, we had confirmed approximately 14,400 legal executions. Now, when I started this work, my feelings on the death penalty were rather ambivalent. I tended to believe that under certain circumstances it was perhaps not only justified but a necessity for the protection of society. I subscribe to some extent to the deterrence theory, that if we kill a man, it's somehow going to prevent other people from committing similar crimes. This 15 years of research has convinced me that this is not the case at all. And I have gone from the position of a person who was rather ambivalent to one who is opposed to capital punishment under any circumstances. I would like to tell you some of the reasons why. And the first thing that I'd like to discuss with you is the deterrence subject. If the execution of a man makes a profound impression on anyone, it should certainly be on members of his own family. There is currently a man on death row in the state of California who is also under sentence of death in Nevada to be asphyxiated in either state, whichever one he runs his appeals through first. This man's name is Gerald A. Gallego. In 1955, his father, Gerald A. Gallego Sr., became the first man to be asphyxiated by the state of Mississippi. As we all know, in March of last year, James David Autry was executed by lethal injection in the state of Texas. In June of last year, his 27-year-old brother, and they were very, very close, strangled a 59-year-old woman and is now facing trial on a capital charge in the state of Texas. We found a case in the 1870s in Alabama where a man was hanged one day for rape, a black man. His own half-brother witnessed the execution. And that very night a woman was raped. This brother was arrested for the rape. He confessed and was taken from the jail and hanged in a lynching from the same gallows from which his brother had been executed. There's even some humor in what we find that shows that it's not a deterrence. We found a mountaineer in Tennessee who they hanged, and they let him drink all he wanted before they took him to the gallows. And when he got on the gallows, he told them, he said, well, you know, I've been to 12 or 15 hangings in my life, and they were all a lot of fun until this one. So it doesn't make it have the deterrent effect on people you would think it does. In fact, the demoralization effect oftentimes offsets the deterrent effect. After practically every public execution, you would have fights, many times new killings. But the effect on the young was possibly the most demoralizing thing at all. In 1882, a man named Mack Henderson was hanged in Bainbridge, Georgia. A minister, a black minister who lived on the outskirts of town, took his children to witness execution in order that they might receive the salutary effects from seeing a criminal punished for his crimes. This minister's youngest son was very religiously inclined himself, and it did make quite an impression on him. For the next couple of weeks, he played the hanging of Mack Henderson. He placed a board across a corner of a fence and had a scantling above it with a rope suspended from it, and he would get on the gallows and he would preach the sermon that was preached at the execution, and then he would make Mack Henderson's last speech. This went on for 2 weeks, and around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the little boy started out to play Mack Henderson, and his mother told him to come in shortly, that they were going to have dinner, and the kid said, well, I'm going to go with Mack Henderson today. When the kid did not come in for dinner, they went out and found him hanging. He had literally hanged himself. There was another kid in Bainbridge playing the same game. Needless to say, his parents promptly made him stop. When John Lewis Evans was executed in Alabama in 1983, I was shocked to see on the front page of the Montgomery Advertiser about a week later a picture of a precocious 10-year-old child in Valdosta, Georgia, only 40 or 50 miles from Bainbridge, where the little boy had hanged himself. This kid had built a miniature electric chair for a science project in his class and had been awarded a special medal for creativity. That was the impression that the Evans execution made on him. And the reporter asked him, said, well, son, how do you feel on capital punishment? He said, oh, I'm all for it. Is this really the type of impression that we want to make on our children? If we had public executions, or if we televised them, and were they a deterrent, it makes sense that they should be televised, and that as many people as possible should view them. But would we want our children to see them, or would we look at them ourselves? Would it cause public opinion to change? I don't think it would. I think the only people who would watch a public execution or an execution on television would be people who would want more and more and more. They'd say, my goodness, this is better than my favorite comedy show in the evening. This is bloodier than my favorite detective show or war picture. So I think that all of us who have any degree of sensitivity would be repelled at the idea of viewing the taking of a life of another human being, whether it be by the state or by another individual or what have you. Another disturbing thing about the death penalty is the fact that innocent people have been executed. And as long as death penalty statutes remain on the law books, innocent people will be executed. I I'm not going to delude myself into thinking that most of the people on death row are innocent of the crimes for which they're convicted. Most of them are guilty. But there are innocent people there. There have been innocent people executed. Our own research shows that in the state of Alabama, we have every reason to believe that at least 10 innocent persons were executed. This has happened in virtually every state that has the death penalty. And it will continue to happen, or the danger will always be there. And to me, there's nothing more horrible or more sickening than the thought that the state, with all of its majesty and power, the very state that was designed to protect and to secure the lives of persons, the property of its citizens, should unlawfully take the life of one of its citizens, regardless of how poor or how low his station in life might have been. So we have to look at it from the point of view that we run the risk of participating in state-sanctioned murder every time we condone and accept a legal execution in this country. We have found that the overwhelming majority of persons who have been executed have fallen into the lower economic strata, social and economic strata. They have been the minorities, and I don't necessarily mean the blacks. In the northern states, such as Massachusetts and New York, at the period of the great Irish immigrations after the potato famine and all of that, the overwhelming number of persons executed in those states that had received these immigrants were Irish. Then when the Polish started coming in, it was the same thing. When the Italians started coming in, it was the same thing. We in the South have had our built-in minority. I want to give you some very, very brief figures, if I may, on the state of Alabama, which I ran down some time ago on this very subject of discrimination, racial discrimination, and the death penalty. We have confirmed a total of 710 executions in the state of Alabama. Of this total, 610 were blacks, 86 were whites, 10 were Native Americans, and 3, the races were unknown. Prior to coming to Virginia, and the reason that I came up here was Professor Paul Kebb of Virginia Commonwealth University located for me the place in the state archive where the records for the compensation of executed slaves for the period from 1787 to 1865 were kept, and I came up to go through those, which we did this week. But prior to coming to Virginia, we showed that a total of 630 blacks had been executed, 151 whites, 3 race unknowns, and 3 Native Americans, and 45 race unknowns, for a total of 829. Now, this week we have confirmed approximately 400 new executions in the state of Virginia, all of whom were black slaves, which would now mean that over 1,000 confirmed black executions as compared to 151 white executions have taken place in the state of Virginia. I used to think and speculate that the state of Georgia would probably lead in the total number of executions in this country. Currently, New York, or prior to this trip, we showed New York as a leading state with 1,100, but practically all of the executions have been confirmed in New York and Pennsylvania. We showed Pennsylvania with, I believe, 1,089. Virginia will go well over 1,200 now, And of course, there are certain other eras that have not been researched thoroughly in this state's history, and these records of compensations for executed slaves are incomplete. But I now suspect that Virginia will be the #1 state in the nation in the number of civil executions that have been carried out. I might add that they go back farther in Virginia than any other state. Our earliest confirmation is 1608, when George Kendall, one of the original counselors of Virginia, was tried and convicted for spying for the Spanish and shot. Now, we do not show another confirmation in Virginia until the year 1622, when Daniel Frank, who was a servant to the governor, was hanged for stealing certain of the governor's chattels. And yet we are certain that during this 14-year period, many other executions took place, because at that time Virginia was operating under what was called Dale's Law, which was undoubtedly the most draconian law under which any section of this country has ever operated. But we have been unable to verify the executions that took place during that period. The first execution for murder that we have confirmed was in the state of Massachusetts in 1630, when one of the Mayflower pilgrims, John Billington, was executed for the murder of another colonist. Now, the subject of juveniles frequently comes up. For years, we thought that the youngest person ever executed in the United States was a 12-year-old Indian girl named Hannah O'Kewish, who was hanged in New London, Connecticut in 1786. As a result of this Virginia research, we can now state positively that at least 2 other 12-year-olds were hanged, because 2 slave boys were hanged at the age of 12 here in Virginia. One the year following the O'Kewish execution in Connecticut. That particular case, which took place in 1787, was a slave named Clem. He was owned by a man named Hartwell Seat in Sussex County, and he bludgeoned to death Seat's 2 young sons and was hanged. Now, we've got to bear in mind the fact that slaves were property, and the large slave and landowners controlled the legislatures. They didn't object to having recalcitrant slaves executed. They didn't want them lynched. They didn't object to having them executed, provided they could be compensated for it. And in the case of legal execution, they had written the laws to where the state had to compensate them for the loss of their property. Consequently, even though the slave might have killed raped his mistress or killed his master's children, they would not tolerate a lynching. They would insist on a trial which was held within a few days, and the execution was carried out within a month, and that way they could be compensated for the value. We had a case in Alabama, a large planter in Limestone County named Porter Bibb. He was the son of Alabama's 2nd governor, Thomas Bibb. Had a son killed by a 14-year-old slave. Well, the neighbors gathered as quickly as the word came about, and they were ready to burn this 14-year-old boy. The old man Bibb got his gun and held him off. He said, "Now wait a minute, I've already lost a son. This slave here is worth $1,400. You sure are going to burn him and get my money too. We'll try him and let him hang him, and then I can get half the value of him from the state." And that's what they did. Found a case in Missouri where a man was killed by a slave, mortally wounded, and as he lay dying, he called his best friend in and he said, "Now listen, I've got a wife and I've got children. If Missouri, I know I'm going to die. If Missouri executes this slave, my family, I'm incumbent, and my family will only receive 1/2 of its value. What I want you to do is to take him to New Orleans now, before I die and before he's arrested, and send him in New Orleans, get the full price, and bring it back and give it to my family. And that, of course, is what they did. But even after the days of slavery, after the Civil War, the death penalty was used in the South in a manner that almost bordered on genocide. Let me cite you an example, if I may, of electrocutions both in the state of Alabama and in your state of Virginia. We show after 1908, when Virginia started using the electric chair, that 204 blacks were electrocuted, while only 34 whites were electrocuted. In Alabama, we started electrocuting in 1927 125 blacks as opposed to 29 whites. Now these figures are somewhat shocking, but they're there. As a general rule, the people we've singled out to be executed have been the poor, the economically deprived, the social misfits. But this has not always been the case. You Virginians might be surprised to know that in 1905, J. Samuel McHugh, one of the leading attorneys in the state, former mayor of the city of Charlottesville, Thomas Jefferson's hometown, was hanged for the murder of his wife. You had around, I believe, 1912 here in Virginia, a young man named Henry Clay Beatty was hanged for the murder of his wife. It happens that Beatty's father owned the leading department store in Richmond at the time and spent a fortune trying to save his son, but was unable to do so. However, in the most instances, those who have forfeited their life to the executioner have been the poor, the disadvantaged, the socially deprived, the ignorant. Take the Allen clan down in Carroll County. Floyd Allen was sentenced to go to the state prison for selling whiskey. On the day of the sentencing, he was in the court. His family was in the court, his sons and his nephews. And when sentence was passed, old man Allen stood up and said, "I ain't a-going," and pulled a pistol. His sons and nephews did. They shot and killed the judge, the sheriff, the prosecuting attorney, several witnesses, and just had a regular Western shootout and escaped. Well, the gang was ultimately rounded up, and Floyd and his son, Sidney Allen, were electrocuted. These are just some examples of cases where the death penalty has been exacted, and I've tried to cite you some examples here in Virginia. But let me tell you a really sad case, if I may. This happened in the state of Nebraska. There was a young man who was a farmer, a farm laborer, originally from Illinois, went down to work for an uncle on his farm. The uncle's wife was raped and murdered, and the young man was arrested and charged with the murder. There was an old farmer on the jury who held out for acquittal, but he was finally overridden and went along with both the conviction and the death sentence. He troubled himself over it for some time, and a few days after the boy was legally hanged, this old farmer hanged himself. 3 years later, the boy's uncle on his deathbed confessed that he and not the boy had killed his wife, that he had pretended to go into town, but had slipped back, and while the boy was out in the field working, gone into the house, made it appear that his wife was a victim of a criminal assault and killed her. know that I would never be allowed to serve on a jury in a capital case because of my views. I doubt that any of you would be. But that would be a terrible burden to bear. And I just wonder deep down inside my soul, if prosecutors who send innocent persons to the electric chair or to the gallows, and if jurors, the average ones who send them there, if it would really matter to them if they did get the wrong man. You have some exceptional public servants. I think of the Israel case in Connecticut, where Homer Cummings was a young prosecutor who prosecuted a man named Harold Israel and got the death sentence for him for the murder of a Catholic priest. And yet Homer Cummings was not at all satisfied that Israel was guilty. And he spent his own time and his own money and was able to prove that this young man was innocent and to get a pardon for him. Homer Cummings got his reward. A few years later, he became Attorney General of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt, and he was a very, very outstanding Attorney General. But unfortunately, most prosecutors are not that conscientious. They like to close the books on the case as quickly as they can. Getting a death penalty conviction is good politics. Now, I know that my time's running short. I want to get on the road, but I want to discuss one other thing with you, and that's the outlook for the future. It's very, very bleak. In the first place, we should not be at all optimistic about clemency in any of the cases. We have to realize and accept the fact that clemency is a political act. We are, unfortunately, in an overwhelming minority today on this subject. Political animals are going to satisfy the public's lust for blood, even as the Roman emperors performed gladiatorial spectacles and fed Christians to the lions to satisfy the public's demand for blood. So I don't think we can really realistically look for clemency. The picture's very, very bleak. After the moratorium, the first execution was held in 1977. Up until last year, 10 others were held, for a total of 11. Last year, 21 were held. This year, we've already had 3. I would anticipate that this year, the number of executions that will take place in America will be well over 50, or well over an average of 1 a week. Next year, it will be even higher. As the Supreme Court continues to deny certs and to lift stays, to issue decisions that narrow the grounds on which appeals can be based, as they continue to make it clear that they are impatient with the delays that are taking place, we're going to see more and more executions. Oftentimes the news media does a good job, too good perhaps. Sometimes they'll convict a man before his trial. But I'm afraid they're going to let us down on the question of executions. As they become more and more routine, they will be less and less newsworthy. Many of them are going to take place and to come up without us even knowing that they're coming up, and many of them are going to take place with very, very little publicity. This is unfortunate, because we need to be aware of the magnitude of the problem. Certainly when a man like Henry Lee Lucas, or John Wayne Gacy, or Theodore George Bundy is executed, there will be a world of publicity, but on the average man who is executed, there's going to be very, very little. I used to be proud of the fact that when we had executions, some of our people would turn out. There were never many. Some of our people would turn out to protest. it showed that we cared. I attended a vigil at the Atmore prison when Evans was executed. There were no proponents of the death penalty there. I'm very shocked now to see that those who favor the death penalty turn out in large numbers. We are still few. That they carry placards that are oftentimes vulgar and obscene. That they scream and shout things that would be reminiscent really of a crowd at a gladiatorial spectacle in ancient Rome. So I don't know. I don't quite know what the public's coming to. I don't want to get off on peripheral issues. I have strong feelings on a number of things, and I try to steer clear of them. But I'm absolutely shocked to see the public, the politicians, and in some instances police officials, make a hero of a man who went onto a subway with a loaded gun just waiting for someone to say something wrong to him, just like a kid going onto the block with a chip on his shoulder and saying, I want somebody to knock my chip off, and then shoot 4 kids. The man's unquestionably sick, but he's no hero and he's no one to emulate. God Almighty knows that the worst thing that can happen in this country is for us to return to a frontier mentality where we all wear a 6-shooter and defend our rights regardless. It would be a prelude to vigilantism, and by that I mean lynching and things of that nature. Executions are nothing but legalized lynching anyway. But at least you have the semblance of law. But the law is never perfect. And until it can be applied equitably and fairly to all people, the law is not going to recognize justice. It is not justice for Charlie Brooks to be dead, executed by the hand of the state of Texas, and his crime partner, who may well have fired the fatal shot. We do not know to this day which one actually killed the victim, to walk free this year. And yet that is very possibly what will happen, for the simple reason that they were tried by different judges, tried by different juries. His partner got a new trial on appeal. Rather than place his life in jeopardy again, he pleaded guilty and accepted a life sentence. Brooks was not so fortunate as to get a new trial, and he's now dead. So that's arbitrary and unequal justice, and I have thought, I have studied. I see no way that we can ever have the death penalty and have it applied fairly and with equal certainty. So those are essentially the main reasons why I'm opposed to the death penalty. As I said, I wish I could be with you personally tonight. I generally, when I speak, I skip around. I never prepare a speech. I guess I'm just too lazy. But for that reason, I like to be able to open the floor to questions and answer them as best I can. But that's something we'll have to forego tonight. However, I'm enjoying and appreciating having this opportunity to appear to you in this manner. Thank you. How long was that? Well, I'll think of some other